I don't know if anyone has a path on how we regulate this today. GPUs are going to keep getting cheaper. The open source models are really, really good. I mean, frankly, ChatGPT has very good open source competitors right now that fit on smaller form factors. That arm, I think, is the most interesting around regulation. We are building models in this space, and there are some things that I have paused, and I think, like, I don't know what my kids' experience is going to be like in 20 years in life, but it's going to be wildly different than what we know today.
The parallels between bringing tech into a commercial sort of regulated industry, you know, you brought up banking or healthcare, pharma, fin, whatever it might be, and the DoD, right? There's a lot of hand wavy, especially from sort of like the go-to-market side. Oh, selling into the DoD is complicated. It's got different procurement. And I always try to ask them, hey, cool, like, have you ever tried to like sell into JP Morgan?
Very hard.
Yeah.
Very
or
hard.
like Baxter Pharmaceutical. It sucks. Like, it's a terrible process.
Yeah.
They have their own procurement arm. They do everything just like the government.
Sure.
And it takes forever. I think we do a disservice to founders and to like the next generation of defense tech by not driving home the criticality of like fundamental blocking and tackling from corporate growth and strategy and execution. We say, oh, it's complicated because it's the government.
Right.
And we allow for just all of this bullshit to fester.
Yep.
And then you end up with this like weird, bloated on the surface. Like if I were to look on paper right now, I'd be like, oh man, the defense tech industry is booming. Pop the hood on like who's got tech and who actually is on any pathway to sell. And I don't know, 15, 20, 100, I mean, some small percentage of the total, because we're not holding folks to fundamentals, and we're not forcing good corporate behavior.
Yeah. So, okay, there's a couple things. I want to rewind a little bit because this is important.
That's why I clicked it. I was like, we're not getting off this rock.
When I was pretty early with the primer journey, an observation that I had that actually pushed us closer to national security was other regulated industries, going to JP, going to USB, going to any major bank and trying to show the promise of our technology was cool, but bankers also are making money right now. They want technology right now. And then, if you're lucky, if you can demonstrate how good it is and how differentiated it is, et cetera, then you go through all the procurement records. At least, and this is a good and a bad thing in national security because there can be false signals here. In some ways, they had a little bit of a longer leash because they were trying to build art of the possible, especially in 2017, 18, 19, where there were only a few real AI programs writ large that were trying to field new capabilities. So, you know, think of new area, your drones or whatever, AI. Like if you're doing something new, they're right now the Department of Defense has some money, but they know they want to get there. So in some ways, that was probably part of the reason that we had success is we didn't have to have, and you know, the company was still young. It just didn't have the level of maturity of the product suite that some of the other regulated industries would have required. And so that leads you to a good side of working with the national security is like, okay, these guys will kind of help us. They're trying to sort out where this is all going to go, and we might be able to plug in. The flip side of that is now you start to think, okay, I'm going to be able to land these deals, and I'm like knocking the server, and maybe I get on some OT, and you start feeling good about it, and that's where inexperienced founders aren't going to know, okay, how do I get on, you know, this year? How do I get onto the 25? But like, how do I really like, do the blocking and tackling on the hill? And that's where I think, in some ways for me, it's like, well, okay, cool. You actually might be able to get some early signals from national security, but the longer term, you do have to. It helps if you're a founder that's done this a number of times. Say, okay, I know that this is cool, but it is a little sugar, or it's a necessary step for me to get authorities, to get accreditation.
You have to play the hill game.
Yeah. And so that's exactly right. And so that's one part that I think is really important. Let's see, what were the other parts of your question I want to cover?
Just talk about that, the basic blocking, tackling, sort of the regulatory, the hill side of it, right? I think understanding sort of procurement, and to your point about sort of the leash or not, right? On the regulatory side, I think this is an interesting spot to click into because there's big parallels between how I'm thinking if I was in banking or, you know, one of my previous companies, we were doing an insurance play and we had a bunch of conversations with regulators around what the emerging regulatory landscape, ironically, around AI was going to look like.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's okay. So the way I've kind of thought about when I started Yurts, I was working on another startup in idea that was around test harnesses, and I a year and a half, 2 years ago, I was really looking at the large language model space and saying this is totally untapped, because at that time, Cohere, Anthropic, and even OpenAI, there was not a lot of go-to-market motions in the way. Obviously, it's very, very different now. But I thought that the regulatory aspects kind of break into 4 areas. One, there are debates and regulations around data and copyrights. In general, I kind of cut that on my mind. I think that ship's kind of sailed. I feel like you can build synthetic sounds to sound like Miles Davis and Charlie Parker in their instruments. So, I mean, I kind of have a hard time in my mind saying that, yes, we're going to have tons of regulations around what people have written that's in the public domain and try to pay people for that. So that's one thing, and I kind of just cut that out of my brain. The other aspect of AI regulation that you're starting to see is really around like bias. And a lot of state level and federal laws are coming in around, hey, we got to make sure that there's not bias. We got to make sure that we're not, doing the wrong thing in hiring people. There's a law in New York that's been delayed like 3 times around employment biases, in part because regulators tend to be really bad technologists. And so some of these laws sound interesting, but they have no teeth. And so that kind of pushes me into the
flashing back to Congress trying to understand how Facebook makes money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then here's the next thing. It's like, and you see it manifesting right now and saying, all right, well, hey, we need to stop the size of the models that we are building because of all the bad things they can do in the world. And there's, whether it's going to be disinformation, whether it's going to be really inappropriate imagery being made, or is, bots taking over the world. Yep. But I mean, I would argue like at least a large number of the use cases people are scared about in the regulation space around AI, those models are sitting on Hugging Face right now, totally open in the domain and can be used to push on people. So we got to get a little bit smarter of like, okay, what are we really trying to stop? Now, there are the cases, the kind of the fourth arm, which is the bots taking over the world, or at least like multi-agents doing and figuring out reasoning and then taking action on their own. That is kind of emerging, and honestly, it's a little scary. I don't know if anyone has a path on how we regulate this today. GPUs are going to keep getting cheaper. The open source models are really, really good. I mean, frankly, ChatGPT has very good open source competitors, plus or minus, right now that fit on smaller form factors. And so that arm, I think, is the most interesting around regulation that we do need to talk about. And our company is... we are building models in this space, and there are some things that I have paused, and I think like, I don't know what my kids' experience is going to be like in 20 years in life, but it's going to be wildly different than what we know today.
Yeah.